All right, welcome to your last session of the day. Thank you all for being here. When we were putting this together, as you know, we've had different tracks, right? So some of you have been in different sessions earlier today, and we were really excited about this one, so we wanted you to all be here together. And so we started off the morning, right, talking about science and climate impacts, what's happening out there in the field, what are our POW Science Alliance members seeing? And then we moved into policy and solutions, right? Like what out there exists to help us get out of some of the climate scenarios that we are in terms of impacts. And then we moved into advocacy, right? So we just talked a little bit about how do I be an effective advocate? How do I tell my story? And that's something that POW's been doing for a while, right? A lot of you will see that narrative arc and it will be pretty familiar to you. And we feel like the next step that we want to take together, and we invite you to take with us on this journey, is think about how do we actually tailor those stories and that advocacy work to the people that we're trying to reach, right? So in the campaigns world, I don't know where Ben is, here he is, right here in front of me. So Ben is an expert in this. We think a lot about power mapping, right? We think about who are our target audiences, who are we trying to convince, whose mind are we trying to change, and then we figure out who are the right people to reach that audience. And so like a good example of this we talked about with Drew Jones this morning is when we heard that Senator Kyrsten Sinema was kind of on the fence about the BFD bill, right? Remember that from this morning. We knew through kind of some interesting social media that she follows Ted King, a cyclist, and she thought Ted King was a badass. So we asked Ted if he would message her over Instagram. That's like a great example of power mapping, finding the right message. And then we got a message back that said, you know, the senator changed her position on this bill last night, and we're not saying it wasn't due to your text message, smiley face. That is actually true, but it's not really true, but we get to say that it could be true, right? Yeah, that did happen. I'll show you the email. I think it's from a member of their staff who just, was excited that Ted King reached out. So anyway, all that to say, that is an example of power mapping, knowing who your audience is, tailoring your message to that audience. And so at POW, we talk a lot about being cross-partisan, right? And that's a term that Ben brought to us from his previous work in his previous organization. And the reason we talk a lot about cross-partisanship and not bipartisanship is because we think there's room for more than two ideas, right? Who here is excited about that? There's a lot more opinions than just two. So let's think about how we reach all different types of people, and I think that's really presented well in the outdoor state, right? So back in 2019, POW released a study, the Motivating Lifestyle-Driven Advocacy Study, and it was done by a messaging group who does branding for companies like Coca-Cola and thinks about how do we actually talk about climate advocacy and motivate the outdoor state to be climate advocates. And so they did a bunch of focus groups around the country, and what they found is something that Mario talked about last night, but that when we think about the outdoor state, I think a lot of us might think that group skews liberal, right? And that's not actually true. When we look at those numbers, it's about 40% Democrat, 30% Republican, and 30% independent. And so for us to be effective as advocates in yielding the power of the outdoor state, bringing us together, wielding the power, right? Not yielding, and coming to an audience to bring people together, we need to have all of those perspectives on board. We can't just go out and speak the same story to different people, right? And so that's what we're here to learn from our panelists today. And so I'm really excited to introduce Carly Matthews from the American Conservation Coalition. Some of you who were at our summit last year met their executive director, Benji Backer. So we're going to hear more from Carly. We also are welcoming back Rebecca Rodriguez, who worked for Congressman Curtis, who's the founder of the Conservative Climate Caucus. And we also have Canyon Woodward, a proud member of the POW Alliance and also a very talented Democratic organizer. And so we're going to talk about how do we reach different audiences kind of within the outdoor state, within the community. Some of you may have caught the fact that Canyon just wrote a book and it just happens to be outside, and some of you can get copies of that on your way out. So we're really excited to hear from these three and talk about what are the words that we use, what's the messaging that we use, what are the values that we're trying to connect with people on, and what does that look like? And then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, Carly's going to kick us off.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lindsay. I'm really excited to be here. I think this is going to be a really informative talk. And so a little bit about me, maybe. Just going to figure this out on the fly. Okay. Sure. Am I going back?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Well, this is fun. Okay, so we're going to talk about communicating your passion for the outdoors from a conservative perspective. As Lindsay said, I'm the communications director at the American Conservation Coalition. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides, but we were founded essentially to build the conservative environmental movement and give a voice to young conservatives who didn't know how to advocate for what they believed in. So a little bit about me. We'll address the elephant in the room. I'm a conservative, I'm the elephant, and I am also a climate advocate, right? So I came to this space, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, I went to school in Philadelphia, and I immediately got involved in the conservative movement in college, and I realized pretty early on that no one was talking about the environment. And coming from a rural community, it was something I really cared about. And I grew up hunting and fishing with my dad. I grew up, just being outside. I was a ballerina for 15 years, so I wasn't outside that much, but I certainly had an appreciation for it. And now you can see my child, aka my dog, is the person or being that I spend the most time with outside now. And I do this work because I hope that someday I can share that with my human children someday. So ACC, like I said, was founded to build the conservative movement. We were founded about 5 years ago in 2017 by a group of young conservatives who were equally frustrated by the conservative movement and kind of the traditional environmental movement. They felt that there was a gap in the market, kind of in both areas, right? They didn't know how to really get across what they thought about environmentalism with the existing kind of infrastructure that was in the environmental movement. And now we have more than 130 branches across the country of young conservatives, young independents, young moderates, who are really kind of advancing this idea of pragmatic, effective climate action that involves conservatives, right? So that was something that really wasn't being done when we were founded in 2017. And then we also have a 501c4 called ACC Action, and that's where we do kind of our legislative advocacy. We endorse candidates, but ACC itself is more of an educational, community-based organization where we kind of bring people together to learn how to kind of talk about these ideas. And then ACC Action is the advocacy piece. So I am comms director, as I said before, and what does this mean? I've explained it to many people who have no idea what a comms director does. I promise it's a real job, and I get to talk to people for a living. And it's really interesting to kind of tailor your message to the different audience that you're in front of without changing your values, right? It's not changing who you are, it's not changing who you believe, but it's meeting someone else where they are and what they believe in, so that you can find that common ground. I think a lot of times people think of comms directors or PR people as kind of sneaky. They're trying to get you to believe something that you don't believe. But I really believe that my job is like finding that common ground and being able to expand to that common ground. And I'm juggling way too many things, so I hope you are patient with me. So I think something that I kind of came into this job thinking is that, okay, I just need to know the data, and then I can tell people that data, and then they'll agree with me. That is not true. I think all of you have realized that. And there's a really interesting John Oliver segment where he talks about kind of studies in general. And there's all these like very cringe-worthy news clips of saying like, oh, well, just pick the study that sounds good to you. And like, if you want to drink coffee, that's fine that another study says it'll kill you. Like, just pick the one that makes sense to you. So my point here is that for every study that you think is credible, probably is credible, there's kind of an equal study that someone else thinks is credible, right? And someone else has put a lot of kind of confidence in. So if you're leading only with that data, you're going to lose them right away, right? Because they already have kind of that North Star that you're kind of relying on, and your common ground is lost, right? So data is not the way to lead. Of course it has a place. We do a lot of op-eds at ACC, a lot of letters to the editor, and we of course include data, but it's not what we lead with. And I think that's really important to kind of realize. So what do we lead with? We lead with our personal story, our why, an anecdote that means a lot to us, right? And people don't care about facts at the end of the day. I know that sounds terrible. I know we all want to think that we're, logical, rational creatures that care about the facts, but really we do lead with emotion, right? And I think that's why POW is so successful, in that you all have this deep connection to the environment, to your sport, to whatever activity that you hold dear, and that's what guides your activism, right? Your activism isn't guided by the UN or the IPCC at the end of the day. It's guided by this idea that you really care about the environment and you want to protect it. So I think it's really important that you connect with someone on that human level first. And that's why I showed you pictures of my dog, of me hiking at my friend's wedding, and not, pictures of me doing politics or speaking on another panel like this. I wanted to connect on kind of that human level first and show you hey, I might be a conservative, we might disagree on a lot, but we do have this common denominator of loving being out in nature, and our motivations are the same, right? We both want to preserve this planet for future generations. So I think that that's, kind of what you need to kind of guide your activism with. And the other thing that I think about a lot, especially as a comms director who does a lot of writing, is don't be a walking dictionary, right? Big words are impressive. You can talk about human-caused climate change, and you can name drop, all these scientists. You can talk about all these technical terms, and it's not going to make the impact that just sitting down and talking about, your experience with snowpack shrinking in your hometown is, right? It's not as impactful. Okay, so this is kind of a little activity. It'll take 2 seconds, but read both of these, and if someone wants to shout out, which one is more impactful and why, that would be super helpful. Second one? Yes, exactly. So like I just said, in practice, you're connecting on that human level, right? You're not just guiding your activism with what the IPCC says. So I want to kind of back up a little bit, because obviously I am the conservative in the room along with Rebecca. So I know that a lot of you maybe are kind of struggling to get over that hump of, where is the common ground with the conservative? I think both sides of the aisle make a lot of assumptions about each other, and it's important to kind of break those down when you're going into a conversation if you want it to be successful. And I also want to frame these next couple of slides with, I'm not telling you what to believe or what kind of your end goal of your activism should be. I'm trying to explain what kind of the acceptable entry points with conservatives are so that you can get to that common ground and accomplish your goal. So some kind of climate triggers for conservatives. I hear all the time in my work when I meet with someone who's perhaps more conservative than me, and I'm trying to convince them that conservatives should engage more on this issue. They say, okay, fine, whatever. I concede. Just don't destroy the economy. Right? That is one of the biggest red flags for a conservative, is when they feel like jobs will be lost, GDP is going to go down. And I know those sound like, especially GDP, it sounds like kind of inhuman. It sounds like, why do we care about the GDP when the planet's on fire? But those have human impacts, right? We saw that during COVID. The only impact wasn't just people getting sick. It was people losing their jobs, not being able to pay their bills. There are kind of, sub-impacts to economic impacts that aren't heartless. I feel like a lot of times we kind of say you only care about the economy. Well, the economy has human impacts, right? And we have to think about those. Next up is, I think it's easy to demonize fossil fuels, and the actual fuel, right, emits carbon, and we should, not want to do that as much. But we have to think about how fossil fuels contribute to communities. I have a friend who grew up in West Virginia, and the only reason she was able to go to college was because the coal lobby gave her a scholarship. So when someone says, all coal workers are evil or the coal industry is evil, that is a huge red flag to her, because she's able to have this career as an engineer now because of the coal lobby, directly because of that. So it's really easy to demonize fossil fuels. It's really easy to just have an enemy in general, but kind of understanding that, there are human impacts to these industries, and kind of almost emotional connections, right? There are generations and generations of coal miners who see that as part of their identity, and if you come into a conversation immediately vilifying that identity, you're not going to get very far in that conversation. The next thing is kind of touting the ability of government to make change. conservatives don't like the government. And that's just kind of a fact of life. I always give the example of like, okay, you have to renew your driver's license and you have to go to the DMV. Like that should strike fear into your heart that you have to go to the DMV and deal with whatever is going to happen in that building. I've never had a positive experience with the DMV. So I think there's kind of this genuine kind of distrust of what government is capable of, and kind of leading with, well, all we need to do is get the government to act on this is not going to be an effective entry point. That's not to say that conservatives are against all climate action that comes through the government. It's not what I'm saying at all, but having that be the first entry point that you try to get them bought in on is not going to be effective. And then the last thing, or second to last thing, is the Green New Deal has become this absolute like boogeyman of a climate policy to conservatives. And whether or not the Green New Deal is what Fox News thinks it is, that is what viewers of Fox News think it is, right? So entering was saying, we just need a Green New Deal. This is, just using that label is going to be an immediate turnoff. Now, that's not to say that you can't go into the actual policies that are in, the Green New Deal and might help that individual's community. That's a better entry point than just kind of immediately using that hyper-politicized rhetoric that, has just been weaponized really by media, politicians, etc. And the last thing I'll say here is you just really want to approach this conversation as equals, right? I think Canyon will get into this more about not kind of lecturing and being this kind of elite voice in the room, but approach the conversation without making assumptions and thinking that this person is your intellectual equal, can have a discussion about these issues, and isn't immediately going to just turn to climate denial, right? Giving someone the benefit of the doubt, I know it sounds cheesy, is really important to have a successful conversation. And I have some words over here about that are just kind of some general triggers. Transformational and radical. I know that can be inspiring to some audiences. It is not inspiring to conservatives. Calling it a climate crisis rather than climate change is kind of an immediate trigger. I know that obviously everyone in this room is very concerned about climate change. We view it as an existential crisis, but leading into a conversation with a red-blooded conservative was saying this is a crisis, that it's not going to work. They don't think it's a crisis. Climate justice or environmental justice, I think the actual policies that fall under that can be part of our common ground. But again, that label is just very politicized. It's not going to be welcome for conservatives. And then these next couple, I'll show you kind of the alternative on the next slide. But green, sustainable, and like regulation, they're not bad words in of themselves, but there are better words that kind of like ring a better bell for conservatives than those. Okay, so now we're going to go into kind of green lights for conservatives on climate change. Anything that's kind of transformational or radical is obviously not what we're going to lead with, as we said on the last slide. But we can kind of go to that lowest common denominator, right, and say, let's talk about our connection to nature. Let's talk about sportsmanship, being outdoors. Everyone has like that story in their childhood where they just had this like absolutely magical experience in nature, and it's so easy to bond over that. That's an excellent entry point, and I don't think just for conservatives, but especially for conservatives to kind of get them engaged in the conversation. Again, kind of going on the tangent of, the government not being the end-all be-all, the government being distrusted by conservatives. Any examples that you can give of the private sector acting on climate and having a lot of success is going to make a conservative kind of understand, what the potential of this conversation is. Conservative audiences that I've talked to love to talk about, small modular nuclear reactors that Bill Gates is really financing. They love to talk about carbon capture projects. They even love to talk about regenerative agriculture and things that are happening, on the ground with local knowledge. So anything that you can bring up that's kind of a success story that doesn't directly involve government is always going to be a good entry point. The other thing, and I think I just touched on this, but conservatives want to trust the folks on the ground. They want to go to the lowest level first. So rather than having, like a huge swath of bureaucrats from Washington go to Montana and tell them how to like herd bison, saying that you entrust Montanans to know their land, know their ecosystems, and manage them properly is going to kind of gain that trust in this conversation. Yeah, I think this was really evident when the Bureau of Land Management was moved out west. There was kind of this outcry of like, oh no, we're decentralizing this, it won't be as effective. And I think some like kind of well-intentioned conservatives were saying, well, but they're closer to the land that they're managing. So shouldn't that be a positive? And there were other factors that went into that decision, but I think that's a good example of conservatives kind of trusting local knowledge and knowledge on the ground. And the last thing here is avoiding doom and gloom language. We just talked about it with kind of climate crisis versus climate change. But I think leading with an optimistic attitude, even if you don't feel optimistic in your heart at the moment, saying, we can do this and there are solutions and we just need to invest in them, I think is a really good entry point. And some good kind of words they're green flags for conservatives. Conservation is always a great kind of subject to lead on. Conservatives are much, much, much more comfortable with conservation than climate change. And the two can work together, can help the climate. So there's an entry point there. Talking about things that are cost effective, pragmatic, actionable. Those are all really green lights for conservatives. This goes back to what I was saying about green, sustainable, and regulate. Instead, we could use cleaner, faster, responsible, and empower. Those are words that mean more to conservatives, are more friendly, comfortable, and will lead to a more successful conversation. So I think the last thing I want to touch on here is there is a lot of common ground when you sit down and have a conversation with someone, whether you're the progressive or the conservative in the conversation. And I think, we don't talk about it enough because it's not, a sexy headline. I'm a communications director, so I work with media a lot. And I can't tell you how many times a reporter has told me, like, well, this isn't really a story because it's happy. Like, why would I write about it? And I'm like, okay, but it's true, right? There has to be kind of that conflict for it to be a good story, for people to, really want to pay attention to it. And sitting down and having a really productive conversation where no one's throwing a punch isn't that conflict that someone's looking for, right? So I think that's kind of my my goal in my job, but also in my personal life, is not make assumptions about who I'm speaking to, finding that agreement. And I think specifically on climate, the agreement is that personal connection to nature. It's cost-effective, pragmatic solutions that might not solve climate change by themselves, but are really good steps in the right direction. Innovation, natural climate solutions. And I think that we can make a lot of progress, just both coming to the table.
Hey y'all, I am Canyon, trail runner and political organizer, climate activist. What's that? Jewel smoker. Apparently this is just a clicker. Let's see, I don't consider myself an expert in this by any means, and we have so much expertise in the room. I look forward to teasing out, hopefully, in the discussion portion. But have been organizing for about a decade now, with roots beginning as a campus organizer, in school organizing for fossil fuel divestment. That's how I met Chloe, who I wrote the book with, and who is one of my best friends and co-conspirators, who some of y'all might remember from Moab, for those of you who were at that summit.
Run for office!
Run for office! Yeah, pick up a book. Thank you, pal, for getting those. Hopeful that that'll plant some seeds to think about running for office. It is scary, but it's not as scary as it probably feels or is intimidating. And yeah, run for office. We really, really need more young folks, especially, jumping in there and running, especially for local and state level office. But yeah, I got involved through climate advocacy. Chloe and I co-coordinated the divestment campaign. Took about a decade, but Harvard finally divested from fossil fuels. Yeah. And after college, Chloe moved back to Maine, to a super rural district that she grew up in, and I moved up there to manage her campaign as she ran for state representative in a district with a 16-point Republican advantage. So going door to door, talking to a ton of folks with Trump signs, and convincing them that this 25-year-old kind of radical green, welcome to green hell, kind of climate activist could be a good representative for them. And she won that election. And then in 2020, she ran for state senate against the highest ranking Republican in the Maine legislature, and unseated him, became the youngest female senator in Maine's history. Yeah. So a lot of my headspace has been more on kind of how do we communicate to the middle and to those Trump folks lately, but also a lot of experience and background in kind of the more radical divestment, climate justice space as well. This is us blockading the president's office, surrounding the University Hall. Got Bill McKibben and a lot of other heroes come and blockade with us, sleep out in sleeping bags in the hedges and cause a ruckus. So as cliche as it is, and this isn't unique to progressives by any means, but have to lead with it, it's just being authentic with your message. It's something that I feel like was fundamental to our campaigns. So much is top down in at least what I've seen of the Democratic Party. Like you show up and there's candidate and staff trainings, and basically they hand you a sample budget. And it's like, okay, here are your consultants. They're gonna package you up and produce all of your mail, all of your signs, all of your literature, and what we end up with is just like the same. It looks like the same generic. Like you went to IKEA and you got a candidate with a different face, but it's pretty much the same as last cycle. And people can smell inauthenticity a mile away, and it really is a turn off. And so we said no to the consultants, and we're just like, we're gonna figure it all out ourselves, for better or worse. And for the most part, it really resonated with folks, and people could tell, like hand-painted signs throughout the district, mailers that weren't from this exact mold. And I think it's something that PAL does well with the public narrative trainings that we offer, is being able to tell your story and come from an authentic place, not this top-down, like so many outdoor brands do, of just like everybody posts the same video, posts the same messaging for like pro athletes. So that's really important. It can be perilous at times, like one of my early forays into graphic design here. It's probably too small for you guys to see, but I misspelled Democrat on all of the door hangers in 2018 for our primary Democrat.
That's probably what won you the election.
Yeah. Oh God, I'll never live that down. So some of y'all might be familiar with moral foundations theory. Jonathan Haidt, he wrote Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. I found it to be a really, really helpful framework for thinking about how we tap down to kind of the core values and moral frameworks that we can reach different audiences on. And I'm going to start us off with a quick little lightning speed activity. We're going to do a thumb scale I'm going to read a handful of statements, and thumbs up is strongly agree, moderately agree. Please don't do the middle. You can do just above the middle, but resist the urge to do just the middle, or strongly disagree, moderately disagree. So we'll start off with an easy one. It's better to do good than bad. Sick. Okay. All right. Compassion for those who are suffering is the most crucial virtue. Okay. One of the worst things a person could do is hurt a defenseless animal. Okay. When the government makes laws, the number one principle should be ensuring that everyone is treated fairly. Cool. Justice is the most important requirement for a society. There's no right and wrong answer on these. Also, don't be nervous about just putting your thumbs up. I'll explain this in a minute. But all right, justice is the most important requirement for a society. Where are we at? Okay. I am proud of my country's history. It is more important to be a team player than to express oneself. Interesting. Yeah. Respect for authority is something all children need to learn.
There's a lot of you that don't have kids. You just wait.
All right, last couple. Men and women each have different roles to play in society. I would call some acts wrong on the grounds that they are unnatural.
One more time?
I would call some acts wrong on the grounds that they are unnatural. Chastity is an important and valuable virtue. Yeah. That was just mine for fun. I'm just kidding. So those are the questions that Jonathan's team used in their research on moral foundations theory. So the first two were concerning the Care and Harm Foundation and the Fairness Cheating Foundation, which are the two primarily that liberals stand on. And then loyalty and betrayal, authority and subversion, sanctity and degradation were kind of the last three sets of questions. And conservatives don't place as high of a value on the Care, Harm, and Fairness Cheating Foundations as liberals do. That's pretty much almost exclusively what liberals stand on. But those are also important for them, but pretty much equal with the other three foundations. And that was important for me to learn because I feel like it kind of got down to why there's such a disconnect where I absolutely couldn't understand where the other side was coming from oftentimes, and oftentimes it's because it was from one of those other three moral foundations that as a green hell liberal I don't stand on. And it's something that we incorporated a good bit into our campaign messaging, trying to reach over to pull in that 16% Republican base that we needed to flip this district. So, for example, appealing to the In-Group Foundation by translating Chloe's deep commitment and love for home as loyal representation, as those were words that we put front and center in a lot of our messaging. And prominently centering the fact that she was raised there in Lincoln County. That was something that appealed more to the conservative framework. We have appealed to the Authority Foundation, framing Chloe's vision for the future, including climate, as key to protecting the traditions and cultures of the past I'm running for state senate knowing that if we fail in the future, we're certain to lose what we love and cherish of the past. Was the opening of our first piece of mail for the 2020 campaign. Together we can ensure that District 13 is a resilient community that means the strength to protect our past, feel safe in the present, and stay strong in the future. It's about withstanding new challenges while holding on to what makes our community special. In Carly's example that we saw earlier, the authority framework was definitely present in the like respect for the traditions. Like I grew up hunting and fishing, and I want that for future generations. And the future generations part, that's appealing to the CARE Foundation as well. Yeah, so happy to dig more into that in discussion. I've found it super helpful, and I think it's important to know, especially for reaching the conservative audience, but also knowing what it is that motivates the progressive and liberal audiences. Like, why is it that we talk about climate justice so much? It's because of the care, harm, and fair foundations. Okay, this was partly for Hillary Hutchinson was originally the moderator. Badass whitewater and whitewater rafter and angler. Point positive, anyone who has whitewater experience has probably heard this. Funny story of my dad back like 50 years ago in the very early forays into whitewater boating. He accidentally got the first descent of the main chute on 7 Foot Falls on the Chattooga because his friends were pointing over there as he was paddling furiously downstream, and he saw the finger pointing, but he missed the other hand going, no, don't go there, don't go there. And obviously you can't hear anything over the rush of the river, and so he just saw that, and he was like, okay. So over time, we've learned in whitewater, always point positive, don't point just directly at the obstacle. And I think that's a good lesson for us in communicating about climate. Like, if we're just beating people over the head with the hockey stick graph or worst case scenarios, like, that's important information to convey, but it causes paralysis. It gets into the fear emotion, and people don't know what the heck to do, and yeah, we just get swept into the hazards downstream. So when we're talking about hazards like the fossil fuel industry, point positive, point to a viable course of action. Like, what can people do? What are the strokes that they can put in the water, whether that's, running for local or state office, or divesting from fossil fuels, joining a POW lobby trip, or simply getting out to vote to get the majorities that we need to pass the stick legislation that Drew was talking about this morning. And progressives were some of the worst, oftentimes the hardest to get on board with tactics because we don't stand on that authority foundation. It's so frustrating. We question and question, and it's one of our superpowers, but it's also our Achilles heel because we're so hard to get in line. So I think that's one of our big challenges is to communicate what are the effective actions, what are the effective tactics, and connect those back to the strategy and to the why of story, and crucially emotion, because the key to action does not lie, as Carly was saying, in the data or the graphs or the figures. It's in the emotional part of the brain, and some emotions, like fear, inhibit action, while other emotions inspire action. So this is a list that I found handy from Marshall Gans, who a lot of you are probably familiar with from public narrative training, of action motivators on this side that can overcome these action inhibitors that we run into on the left side. So inertia, the security of habitual routine can blind us to signs of the need for action, while urgency and sometimes anger get our attention, drive us to action. And fear, like we've covered, is paralyzing. It drives us to rationalize our inaction, and it's amplified by self-doubt and isolation. Like, how do I tackle something so big by myself? And leads to despair. On the other hand, hope can inspire us in concert with you can make a difference, like pointing towards this. You're not alone. You're in this together. There's a viable course of action. We can become that big fish turning on the fossil fuel industry together. And really, I think emphasizing urgency for progressives is one of the most important things. Like, why climate? Why even just like why voting? Or why going out and knocking doors and connecting the dots to the larger strategy, and why that's an urgent thing to do as opposed to all of the Instagram scrolling that you could do in the meantime instead. And rooting it back into those shared values and a sense of collective action.
You don't have to go any further because I didn't prepare. I'm Rebecca Rodriguez. I'm the Director of Federal Affairs for Boundary Stone Partners, which is a Washington, D.C. based multi-client firm that does government relations for climate-related clients. So that's anything from associations of businesses that are trying to decarbonize the grid to really cool tech companies that are inventing things that I'm so glad they're smarter than me and figured out how to do stuff. And I brand new there. I started in August, and before that I spent about 4.5-ish years on Capitol Hill, working primarily with Congressman John Curtis from Utah. While I was there, he himself went through a little bit of a climate shift. When he first came to Congress, he was one of those Republicans that when you asked him if the climate was changing and if humans had an influence, he would look at his shoes and not really know what to say. And I think that that's where, up until about 2.5 years ago, the majority of the party was. And I can totally feel why everyone would be frustrated with us, and I think that there's nobody really to blame but ourselves for not engaging and not defending what we were doing. It wasn't that we didn't care about the environment. Conservatives really do care about the outdoors and the environment. And I'll talk a little bit about language and kind of build on what Carly said too, but I think it was a connotation that they weren't comfortable with. But anyways, he had the youngest district in the country. So our average age is 27 now, extremely young. Utah, if you know anything about it, big families, young families. So that's part of what drove it down. But we also had Brigham Young University and Utah Valley University in our district. So he would go and talk to young people and young conservatives a lot. And he would come back and say, I don't know how, to look them in the face and say that we're not going to do anything on climate. This is a big issue for young conservatives. I think there's a difference, and Carly probably knows the numbers better than I do, but where there's a shift, that young conservatives care about this. So anyways, fast forward, he became the first Republican member to say on the floor of the House of Representatives that the climate is changing and that humans have influenced it. And that is crazy that happened in 2019, that's when that happened. He got a standing ovation from the Democrats that were all in there. It was during here's an inside scoop, there's never members on the floor. Very rarely are there all of them down there. This just happened to be one of the times that there was all of the members down there. So he got a standing ovation from the Democrats, and then he finished his sentence with, and we need to do something about it, but we need to be pragmatic about how we do it. We need to make sure that we don't make a transition that we're not ready to actually make, and that it's not going to affect our economy in a way that we can't come back from. And so then he got a standing ovation from the Republicans. And we're all watching back in our office like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And we had a really good reception from both sides of, oh my gosh, thank God a Republican's finally saying something. And, well, hold on a minute, what do you mean we don't have to do it right this second? And we can't just turn off lights tomorrow. So that was, fast forward again, he realized that the rest of the party just wasn't there yet. And we didn't have time for them to take as long as he did to get there. So he said, I want to do a climate summit in Utah. And this is in January, mind you, January 2021. He goes, I want to do a climate summit in Utah with Republicans only. And I want it to be a secret. And I said, okay, boss, we'll have you have like 4 friends there. Super excited. Great. We ended up having 25 Republican members fly out to Utah on their own dime. 6 of those were members of Republican leadership for closed-door meetings to talk about how we as a party need to engage in this. Carly was there. At one point, things got a little tense, but it was really good. And we came out of that with the idea of having a caucus. And for those of you who don't know what that means, caucuses are groups in Congress. For lack of a better idea, think of them as like high school clubs, where they all get together sometimes and they just talk about an issue. Now, there's a couple different kinds of caucuses. There's like, I don't know, there's probably a caucus for like carpet. Like, I'm not even kidding. There's so many caucuses. And some of them are just so that they can go home to the carpet makers in their district and say, I'm on the carpet caucus, I care about your issues. Some of them are very, very powerful. And, you know, I think the Progressive Caucus is one that talk about being hard to control. I am not jealous of Nancy Pelosi's job, trying to rein in sometimes when she has to. And, you know, Freedom Caucus is the same way on the conservative side. And they're powerful. They can change how a vote goes. And then there's educational caucuses, which really say we aren't making you sign up for a policy, but we are making you sign up for some tenets. And that's how we wanted to do the Conservative Climate Caucus. We wanted it to be a safe space for Republicans to talk about this. Because nobody knew how to come talk to us about climate because we weren't engaging. And our members didn't know how to talk about climate because they felt like if they said climate, they were automatically looped in with the Green New Deal. And I think, kind of like Carly said, the Green New Deal means so much more to Republicans than it does on paper. I hate when my boss used to use this analogy, but I'm going to use it. If I were to say to you, like, walls stop people from coming through, that's like a fact. Like, I cannot walk through this. But if I say a wall on the border would stop people from coming in, not only does the wall bring up a barrier, it brings up all of Trump's policies. It brings up all of those immigration issues. The connotation of it means something different because that's how we as a society have come to call it. That's how climate was to Republicans. When you said climate to us, it was, you're killing jobs in my district, you are making energy prices higher, and you're making me subscribe to the social stuff that is in the Green New Deal. Which, whether or not that's true, that's how it's perceived. And so we went on this mission to tell Republicans that it's okay to say the word. Like, I joked, my boss is very he's perfect and doesn't have a bad bone in his body and has the perfect mind. And so I'd be like, yeah, you should just tell people to say the C word, ha 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 ha, and he wouldn't get it. And I'm like, okay, my bad. But really, that's what it was. It was just let's just say the word because words matter. And when we went to go talk about conservation to Democrats and progressives, they came back to us with climate. Well, then we stopped because we're not talking about the same thing anymore at that point. Or we go to talk about environmental stewardship. Oh my gosh, Republicans love that word. Environmental stewardship. I can't go anywhere without somebody telling me about it. But because we're not using the same language, we weren't being taken seriously. And there's been a shift in the Republican Party to finally use the word climate. I know that someone said that earlier today. That was a big step for some members. And I know that sounds really stupid. I get it. But that was a big deal for them. It's a big deal for them to sign up to something that says climate's changing and humans have influenced it. But we recognize that the words matter. And if we want to be taken seriously and have our ideas taken seriously, we need to be using the same words. Starting the caucus was really easy. Well, okay, it wasn't easy. It was a lot of work. But gathering members was really easy. Right before we launched, when I left the office, we had 30 members, right? Because I'm also, like I said, I'm the pessimist. My boss was like, I want a caucus. I said, okay, we'll get you your like 20 friends. When I left the office the night before, we had 35 members signed up, and when I got to the office the next morning for the launch, we had 60. And to us, that was like, okay, they're ready. Like, they've been waiting for a place to have these conversations. They might not be ready to like have these publicly with Democrats yet, because they don't know what they don't know, and they need the 101. Like, we're a few years behind, and I'm willing to admit it. I don't know if others will, but I think we're behind, and it's because we just didn't engage. But they're getting there. And kind of like Carly said about like crisis, the biggest reason I see crisis as an issue is there are so many crises. Like, the word means nothing anymore. We had to fly back to DC in the middle of the pandemic to fix the post office crisis. And that was what it was called, was the post office crisis. And at the same time, we're saying, well, but then there's this crisis and this crisis and this crisis. So the word has lost its meaning to a lot of Republican audiences. And I think that's important to kind of recognize when we're talking is it's a major challenge. You could say that and they're going to be like, yeah, no, I get it. And there's so many more Republicans now that are willing to have those conversations and find that common ground. And if I can leave you with any hope, it's that they are trying now. There's always going to be fringe. I'm not worried about them, right? Like, I'm never going to convince them that